So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Spring Day. My name is Anna Kunz, and I'm Impact and Outreach Manager for Earth Investigations Program at Journalismfund Europe. And here with me, under the name of Journalismfund Europe, sits my colleague, Morgan Villarrubia, who is the project coordinator for our grant program. And Earth Investigations is a 2-year initiative, which includes several grants for both media organizations and freelance journalists. And our focus is support for cross-border environmental investigations. We can provide financial support, we can provide mental support, but unfortunately, we do not provide legal support directly. And that is why today we are partnering with Media Defense, because the reason to organize this webinar was unfortunately the threatening situation that is not getting any easier as we speak. And journalists have been threatened, have been killed, have been brought to court, have been assaulted all over the world, and safety and possibility of good environmental journalism was in the focus of UNESCO's last year Press Freedom Conference. Press Freedom Day. So it is a burning question which we hear from our grantees as well. Journalism Fund has a very large network over the years. It has existed for over a quarter of a century now. So we know a lot about how investigative journalism in Europe has developed and what has been its path and what are the obstacles rising now yet more than before. So I'm very glad that everybody is here today to listen to Sabah, who represents Media Defense. Thank you very much, Sabah Ashraf, who's a solicitor with a large experience in working with human rights and also working with journalists. And I think what we need is practical insights, because this is the issue that is very practical. That's not a theoretical issue, but at the same time, what you need to understand are jurisdictions, and what you need to understand is how everything can work cross-border. So that's why I give the floor to Sabah, and I hope she can say a few words about media defense and the way they offer support to journalists all over the world in more than 100 countries, from what I know. Sabah, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much, Anna. Hopefully my connection will stand. Let me know if it freezes at any point. It seems to be a little unstable. Hi, everyone. It's really good to be in contact with everyone. Yeah, as Anna mentioned, thanks so much for joining this webinar, which will discuss the legal considerations for journalists for looking specifically at environmental journalists. So, as mentioned, I'm Sabah. I'm one of the lawyers at Media Defense. Media Defense is an NGO that is based in London. And our kind of core mandate is to provide legal and financial support to journalists, bloggers, independent media across the world. I'm hoping to provide some information about our work shortly, but I know that we are also joined by two other speakers. So I just want to kind of briefly mention who they are before kind of going into the work that Media Defense does. So I'm joined today by Barış Altıntaş, an Istanbul-based journalist and co-founder and current co-director of the Media and Law Studies Association, so MLSA, and Maciek Piasecki, a Polish journalist who has been reporting on human rights developments in Poland and neighbouring European countries for the past decade. So we have approximately an hour and a half for today's session, and the format is going to be for each of us to kind of give a short overview about our work and our experiences. And then following on from that, we'll be holding a question and answer section at the end. Please, those that are attending, do kind of post in the chat, and hopefully we can take those questions at the end of each person's contribution, as well as kind of having a bit more of a focused discussion at the end. So yeah, just kind of before I kind of pass over to the other speakers, I'm going to set out some of the ways in which media defense and the lawyers at media defense are seeing how journalists are being subject to legal recourse for the reporting that they're doing on environmental issues. More generally, we see examples around the world of journalists, citizen journalists, human rights defenders reporting not only on general climate change and its impact on the environment, but also on the kind of behaviors of individuals, corporations, and states in an effort to raise awareness on environmental issues and the kind of severe legal repercussions that they're facing. So in our work at Media Defense, and we work globally, so we're not kind of confined to a particular geographical region. Wherever there's potential for us to get involved and provide our support, we will do that. So what we see is kind of a trend globally in some of the issues that journalists are facing across the world. And one of the things that we've been seeing in Media Defence's work is this rise in strategic lawsuits against public participation. So these SLAPP suits that are taken against public interest reporting on environmental issues, as well as obviously state harassment in the form of arrest, detention, and prosecution. In terms of like these SLAPP suits, often the kind of motivation by those initiating those suits is not even to win the case, but just to exhaust and the kind of the journalist to an extent that they stop reporting in the public interest. So it's draining their kind of financial resources, so tying them up in very costly litigation, as well as kind of having this impact on their morale, etc. And that's something you're seeing in we're seeing in the course of our work in Europe, but more broadly in across the globe. In some of the starkest examples, we've seen journalists being killed in the course of their professional duty. So, for example, Media Defense is partly covering the legal costs occurring in the context of leading out some precautionary measures procedure at the Inter-America Commission following the disappearance and killing of Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira, who were both killed in 2022 in Brazil when they were investigating environmental issues in the Amazon. And among other things, one of the things they were looking at was looking into the illegal fishing trade. So those, I'm sure most people are aware of this case, but Dom Phillips was a British freelance journalist who wrote for various newspapers, including The Guardian, The Times, The Washington Post. And his reporting covered topics such as illegal mining, deforestation, and other kind of human rights issues in Brazil. He was murdered alongside Bruno Pereira, his guide and an expert on uncontacted indigenous people on the Val de Javari in Brazil. So the proceedings and the legal case that we kind of involved in financially supporting at the Inter-America Commission aims not only to secure an effective investigation into the death of both Mr. Phillips and Mr. Pereira, but also to strengthen the protection for journalists and human rights defenders in that area, and ensure that others that are kind of reporting and carrying out their work in a similar manner are kind of subject to protection, so they don't have the same outcome as what's happened here. The aim is obviously to both protect the rights of others who are reporting and working in the area, but also to kind of improve the media landscape in Brazil. So the case before the Inter-America Commission requested precautionary measures, demanding, among other things, that Brazil ensured that a report was done on the investigation and the judicial proceedings to hold accountable to all of those that were involved in the killing. And this is kind of subject to ongoing litigation before the commission. I think most recently in 2023, there was a meeting with Brazil and the commission whereby a joint working table was established, and they had three main objectives in order to kind of like fulfill the precautionary measures to ensure that there was kind of coordination and complementation between the relevant national and international levels, and to ensure that there was direct participation of the beneficiaries and the petitioning organizations. So that's kind of gives like a brief background on some of the types of cases that we work on, especially those that involve journalists that have been killed, not just reporting on environmental journalism, but more broadly just investigative journalists that are reporting and then obviously are killed as a result of that work. One of the things that Media Defence is able to do is work with local lawyers to be able to put forward cases through the kind of national legal frameworks to ensure that there are effective investigations into the causes of those deaths, to provide some sort of accountability, and representing or working with the deceased's family members, etc. More broadly, and some of the other things we're seeing, in the course of our work is the use of criminal laws to silence environmental journalists from reporting on human rights abuses. So in the course of our work, we see journalists, citizen journalists, and human rights defenders that, for example, might be using their social media accounts to report on human rights abuses, especially in the absence of any independent media. And in those countries, you see the kind of the use of these very broad, overly vague legislative provisions that are being used and targeted to journalists in an effort to stop them from reporting. They are often given very hefty prison sentences, and aside from just deterring that individual journalist that may be working on a investigative piece or reporting on an environmental disaster, etc., it has like a general chilling effect and a deterrent to others that are working on similar issues to stop them from reporting. So this is quite a usual state tactic that we're seeing in the course of our work. Often you'll see journalists that are charged with, like these provisions that are, to do with like conducting propaganda against the state, inciting anti-state commentary, or, provisions that relate to abusing democratic freedoms. We've seen this very much so in our work in Vietnam, where we saw a waiver of arrests of citizen journalists following the environmental disaster, the Formosa spill, in 2016. So a number of journalists that were reporting on this and kind of campaigning for fishermen that had lost their livelihood and were not compensated were arrested on these very kind of heightened criminal charges, and sentenced to 10, 20 years in prison for posting on Facebook, for example. In terms of our work and what we do, one of the things that we are able to do is craft together legal arguments to demonstrate that any restriction on a journalist's freedom of expression is justified. And in making that assessment, it's important for us to demonstrate to the courts that the state action and the state measure does not fulfill what is commonly used within the court's assessment is this three-part test. So i.e., the measures that have been taken by the state do not satisfy the standard through the court system, and as a result, the arrest and the detention and the prosecution of that individual journalist is unlawful. So in terms of just kind of talking about that, and this is one of the things that journalists, when we speak to journalists and we're crafting the legal strategy, and also to kind of other lawyers, students that we work with, the kind of formulating this strategy, the legal arguments can be quite tricky in some cases, with this kind of three-part test of the court. It means that if one limb fails, the whole test fails. But across the board, courts will use this standard to establish whether there has been a violation of freedom of expression. So the three-part test consists of, whether or not that restriction on that right has been prescribed by law, i.e., is there a law or a legislative provision that allows the state to take that action within the national framework. The second limb is that, the actions of the state must serve one of the prescribed purposes that has been listed in that human rights instrument. So, for example, often states will argue the reason for taking this measure is to maintain public order or to protect national security. And they have to, that's a legitimate aim on their part. And then the third limb is whether that restriction is necessary to achieve the prescribed purpose in a democratic society. So for us as lawyers, when we are kind of putting these briefs together, just because there is a law that allows the state to arrest someone under anti-state propaganda doesn't mean that for us it fulfills that first limb of being prescribed by law. There needs to be, international standards on freedom of expression state that, the law needs to be accessible to the public, and it needs to be formulated with sufficient precision to enable a citizen to be able to regulate their conduct. So for us, using overly broad terms in the absence of any guidance can be argued to fall foul of this international standard. So essentially, the provision doesn't meet the international standards, and as a result, the state's action is unlawful. So it's important just to highlight, from a lawyer's perspective, when we are kind of working on this, we can look at the laws, we can challenge the laws, we can make arguments that journalists have a heightened level of protection because of their role as a public watchdog, especially, in key, when they are reporting in key areas such as environmental issues that are happening, or, for example, at protests, etc. I think very, very recently in the UK, we've seen in March a Court of Appeal decision that's come out, which concerns climate protesters who saw that their sentences were moderately reduced. So I think it was 16 climate protesters that were charged under the kind of UK criminal laws for civil disobedience back in last summer, and they appealed their sentence because they were given very hefty sentences on par with someone that had kind of committed aggravated robbery. So the sentences were in line with 5, 6, 7 year terms. That was appealed at the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal looked at that test concerning, the UK's right to protest. And it also looked at this kind of argument of whether the conscientious motivations of the person should be a mitigating factor in reducing the sentence. And whilst, the lawyers argued that given the subject area and the topic here was very topical, it was being raised about climate concerns, essentially, the Court of Appeal ruled that this didn't preclude, and the kind of the conscientious motivations of the individual didn't preclude them from getting quite a hefty sentence. I mean, I think those cases have been heavily criticised by the international community and national communities, and the UK is seen at the moment to be very, hard hitting on the right of climate protesters at the moment. I just want to talk very briefly about one other area of work that Media Defence does. So aside from obviously representing journalists and providing financial support to them, and working on drafting those cases before international courts or national courts, one of the other things that we do are amicus briefs and third-party interventions. So these are kind of, we are not a party to the proceedings. We apply to the court if there is an area of law that we think that we can assist the court to make its decision. And we get invited to submit essentially an expert report or written comments on a particular area of law. And we've done this in a couple of cases relating to environmental journalists. So one case that related to this was the Arctic 30 case, which back in September 2013, the Arctic 30, comprising 28 Greenpeace activists and 2 journalists, traveled across the Barents Sea aboard the Arctic Sunrise. And the aim of the journey was to kind of protest a new oil drilling platform that was owned by a Russian company. The protesters informed the company and the Russian Coast Guard that their plans were to demonstrate peacefully. But as they made their way across the sea and attempted to kind of affix a protest banner, they were kind of met with Russian state agents who immediately arrested and detained the two activists with the banner and ordered the ship, the Arctic Sunrise, to allow their investigation team on board. Despite the ship members' crew refusing to do so, members of the Russian Federation's security service boarded the vessel from a helicopter, and once they were on board, they arrested and detained all of those that were on board. And for us, this case was a paradigm example of the harassment and threats that are facing environmental activists and journalists reporting on environmental issues in Russia, including through their kind of laws of hooliganism, etc. So we applied to the European Court. This case was at the European Court. We applied to be third-party interveners, and we were granted leave to submit those comments. And our intervention argued that actually preventing the media from news gathering and holding government authorities account for protest was a serious interference with the right to freedom of expression. It also kind of questioned the extent to which journalists can be treated, as those that are others observing demonstrations. And actually, for us and within our comments, we highlighted the importance of ensuring that there are increased protections for journalists in such circumstances. The other thing that our intervention looked at was this kind of definition of what is a journalist. One of the kind of the comments that were made by the states was that those that were arrested weren't actually a journalist per se, because they failed to recognize one as a journalist because they had no kind of formal employment contract with any kind of foreign publisher, and they were not accredited as a journalist. So as a result, they shouldn't benefit from the kind of the heightened protections that you would get under kind of international legal standards for a journalist. And in our intervention, we argued that actually you don't require official accreditation, and there's a wide range of actors that may act in this kind of public watchdog function and perform journalistic functions, and as such, they should be given those protections. That judgment came out in 2023, and the court ruled unanimously that the detention of those journalists on board the Arctic 30 was arbitrary, and it amounted to an interference with their freedom of expression. In the judgment, the court acknowledged our intervention, and it kind of cited our evidence of the systemic harassment of journalists that were, covering these matters in Russia. So that was like an example of where we can get involved as media defense and try to set a wider precedent and assist the court in making a decision that relates to the legal protections that are afforded to journalists. And in this case, it was environmental journalists. I realize I am probably at time, so I'm going to stop there and just see if we have any specific questions for me before I move on and hand over to our next speaker. If not, we can just, I guess, have more questions at the end at the kind of focus question and answer section.
I don't see any questions for now, not in the chat, not in the Q&A. So I guess we can proceed, but please feel free to write them there if you have them, and then we can address them at the end.
Great, thanks, Anna. Okay, well, if there's no questions, I'll move on to our next speaker, who is Barış Altıntaş. As mentioned before, Barış is a journalist and co-director at MLSA. So just kind of drawing on her past experiences as a journalist covering environmental issues and her current support for journalists through MLSA. Barış hopefully will discuss the increasing threats faced by environmental reporters into Turkey, including the legal harassment, police violence, and recent court cases against journalists covering such topics such as mining. Just to kind of give a little bit more of an intro into Barış's work, aside from kind of her role at MLSA, she is also a founding member of the Balkan Network of Science Journalists. She's reported on environmental issues, science, and politics for various news agencies and newspapers. And she has moved on to working as a freelance journalist, contributing to various kind of online and civil society groups, etc. So I will pass over to Barış to speak a little bit. There are, I'm sure, a lot of developments that are happening in Turkey at the moment, Barış. So I'll hand over to you to speak to that.
But thank you for the introduction, and thank you for your interesting speech. It was very interesting, also a little bit and not disheartening, but we're seeing that environment reporting is increasingly becoming one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous forms of journalism, and that is unfortunately happening across the globe. And as you said, in Turkey, we're not legal harassment for any kind of reporting has peaked, and it's been increasing since 2016. And it looks like our country has entered a new level starting the 19th of March, as you know, with the detention of Erdogan's number one rival and Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu. And just as we speak, in just 10 minutes before we started the panel, 7 journalists were arrested for covering the protests on charges of violating the law on protests, which is also used very frequently against environmental reporters. But arrests are very rare, and this is the first time I'm seeing it. So I'm a bit, not upset, but I'm shocked, because in the afternoon they were supposed to be released, and in the second moment, in the last moment, prosecutor changed their opinion and then referred them to a court, and then they've now been under arrest for filming the events, the protests in Saraçhane. And yes, exactly. But so just in general, the level of legal harassment that we have been seeing and increasing, I think, is an introduction. And I wanted to today talk about the general harassment that journalists face when reporting on environments, and then give examples from our work as MLSA, because we have 206 journalists that we report, and among them, because I was looking through, I was thinking about the kind of intimidation, and not just legal, of course, that environmental reporters face. And then I found that quite a lot of cases that we have also fall under this category. So I'm just going to go over the main issue that almost every journalist is reporting, especially on mining and energy companies face 60% of the time, if not more. And then I'm going to share examples from our own clients. So one thing that is very common is, of course, as everywhere, is harassment by these companies, and their own. So not even coming to the police or gendarmerie forces, but the security that they hire in their own officials. And they're over the last few years, they're, I think, bolder in intimidating journalists. So when, again, I don't want to, like all the sectors can be equally bad, but mining and energy are horrible in this. And when you're filming on the site, there will be private security. Sometimes they would, a car or a vehicle would start following you to stop you. There's a lot of intimidation that, to stop you from documenting. They'll come try to interfere. They'll try to stop you. And even when you're filming from outside their locations, they would come for you. But one that I find very scary, I want to give an example, and I just chills down my spine, is again belongs to one of our clients, Vedat Örüç, who is currently in prison, by the way, on another journalism charge, accused of membership. It's not related to his environmental reporting, but this was in 2022, and Vedat Örüç and another environmental journalist, Elif, I think Kartaş, they were reporting on a recycling plant. Now, this is a very big issue in Turkey, and one that the government doesn't like being reported on. So Turkey imports a lot of waste from Europe, but mainly from Holland, the UK, and Germany. And this is a huge environmental issue. And all of the waste, of course, not all of it is recycled. And the parts that are not recycled are usually, this has been exposed by environmental journalists. They're thrown haphazardly into fields, into water supply. And so this is in general a big issue. And in 2022, Vedat and his reporter, they were reporting on this Akgül plastic company. And they went there to the company, to the facility. And at some point, I think they had maybe, they were able to reach some of the people. They had some interviews, but they were also filming on the use of illegal immigrant labor. They had a lot of Syrians or Afghans that were being exploited. And at some point, things went wrong. Something just went wrong, or the security officials and the two owners of the company, they got very aggressive. So they chased them. But even when they were outside the company, I find this, nothing happened, nobody dies. But they basically took Vedat, like they physically grabbed him and they took him back into the company, and then they kept him and physically, like pushing him, hitting him for a few hours. It was very intimidating. It was horrible. And the people who did that, they were they also included the owners of the company, so that they wouldn't be they wouldn't be filming it. So this is one of the most, we've had journalists beaten up on site before, but being taken away and being kept in a room. So for now, we have started a case against these people, and it's ongoing. It hasn't concluded, for deprivation of liberty and other charges. And I wanted to be sure that, I wanted to find out what phase this hearing is on. But because our lawyers were at because we have 4 journalists who were arrested today at the courthouse, I didn't ask, but I will happily send an update later on, but it's ongoing. So another one we're seeing very, very often, again, is similar, but this restricted, when these companies, again, especially mine companies, restrict areas, and they put up like physical barriers, they would often rely on the gendarmerie forces or police forces to, they would call them to block protesters and also journalists from filming or, just following the events. This kind of goes hand in hand with this protest laws, because most of the journalists also face, following the protest or the resistance of locals or villagers, also face charges from the state. And I'll come to that, but not only from the companies of these 2911, the law on violating law and protest. But this can also be quite extensive. This is not our client, but maybe you've heard of this big lignite mine in Erzurum İliç, and there was a huge disaster. This is owned by this Canadian company. It's called, I think, Alba Gold Company, and they are also something that journalists are always, the government also stops them writing about. And they were, and there was a huge disaster. And this is an activist / journalist, Sedat Cezarioğlu. And when he was, reporting from there, or he was just showing the extent of the mine, I think this was before the disaster, they blocked him from going on into his own village. So the territorial restrictions, as I said, is not, so the company, they called the gendarmerie, and he was just going to go home to his own village, and they wouldn't let him go into his home. And luckily earlier this year, if I'm not wrong, in January, he won a constitutional court case against the company for violating his right to his personal rights. But I find this, it's not just, being beaten up or just like not even restricted going into the site, but they restricted such a huge area that this guy wasn't able to go into his own home. And another one that we have is, of course, coming to the initiating legal cases and lawsuits against journalists is very common. And one of them, again, from our own journalist, Zeynep Kuray, who was also, again, this is such a bad day, who was also arrested about an hour ago for covering the protests. And So I was hoping that today, oh, she was released, but now she was arrested on other charges when she was following the Akbelen protest in Muğla. And so there's another mining activity by the company's name. I forget the company's name right now, but there's an existing mine I'm sorry, it's YK Mining, YK Madencilik, in Akbelen Forest. And they've been, since 2019, they've been trying to expand this area, getting permits, and there's been a legal battle. The İkizdere, Akbelen, the villagers are fighting. There's a lot of resistance. But then last year, they started illegally cutting down trees. And then we had a large number of journalists rushing to the site. This is also a resistance that has attracted a lot of support from the public as well, because it's been going on for about 5 or 6 years. These villagers, these locals resisting. And there was a lot of course, gendarmerie brutality. The journalists were physically attacked and targeted. But Zeynep Kuray, who was also there, faced an investigation on the basis of Law 217A, which is the law on publicly disseminating false information, which was adopted actually in 2022 and is used extensively against journalists. And this case was initiated on the request of a petition filed by the company, this YK Madencilik at the time. And it was dropped, but it could have not been, and the state prosecutors could have been. I'm just giving, these are the general trends, and these are examples from a smaller set of clients that we have. So I just wanted to also highlight that. And in other ways, we're seeing, again, a lot of censorship by companies and not just by the state. And in another example, when journalists are claiming ownership of sites that they don't belong to them. So this is a bit different from restricting larger areas. So they would be, for example, maybe sponsoring an archaeological site, or they would send their private security, or you can't film from there, or even if you're way outside their the facility, or would they be a public they would be effectively stopping. So a lot of environmental journalists do face active investigations that unfortunately sometimes turn into trials most of the time. And I also want to say that the acquittal rate is quite high. Most of the time, these companies, they lose these cases. And even in these, when the state forces started, like the 29/11 protest law, most of the time, these journalists are acquitted, but the time and the number of hours they spend at courthouses is, especially for journalists who've been doing environmental journalism for more than a decade or for 20 years. This is a very valid concern. We're spending so much time at the courthouse that we can't even follow the time. So the number of cases is, I don't have statistics overall, but this is one of the major issues that environmental reporters talk about, is they're taking away our time through these cases that most of the time, the companies don't win. But this is an increasing issue. And unfortunately, like the case of Vedat Örüç, that, him being just captured by these people, we're also seeing more violence. And then earlier you referred to journalists who were killed. And we had a couple who were killed in Antalya 7 years ago for their activism against a quarry. And their daughter is now carrying on their fight with the locals. But it's an increasingly, let's say, it's increasingly getting more violent and dangerous. And we had seen, for example, journalists getting beaten by these trustees or the trustees that they appoint in place of municipalities, or the police being aggressive. But increasingly, we're seeing companies just, having that kind of the nerve to basically kidnap a journalist for a few hours. And these are the few examples I want to share for now at this point.
Thanks so much, Barış. I mean, yeah, you've painted quite a stark picture of what's happening in Turkey, but yeah, I'm sure it's very busy over there at the moment. But thank you so much for kind of providing that overview. I'm going to move on to I've had a look, I don't think there's any specific questions directed to Barış on that.
Well, there is a question to both you and Barış, and maybe we could address it at this point and then move on. A question for both speakers from Gustavo Faleiros. Do you see changes in the pre-publishing practices by journalists? Are they working on better risk assessments or requesting legal reviews of the documents and data used in their stories? Any recommendations of cautionary actions we can take?
I think for the case of Turkey, we're definitely in every kind of reporting. There's a level of obviously not. I don't want to call it self-censorship, but journalists are very careful about how and what they phrase, how they phrase things. And my recommendation is definitely always, well, stick to the journalism principles of journalism. Don't be. This is not a criticism of anybody, but sometimes sometimes journalists like to phrase things more activist-like, and then you don't need that. And then because these are also make life a bit easier for your lawyers if something happens. Just have your documents, make sure that everything is proven, and then stick to the facts. And I think going back to the I think that's very important when even in Turkey where rule of law has ended, having a neutral language, which is basically the basis of journalism, provides a degree of protection, even if you're faced with a trial. From like our experience in the courts, show that kind of language. Of course, any language should fall under freedom of expression, but that could be a bit more helpful for legal defense.
Thank you, Barış, and I can only support that. I would say be prepared in advance and know your rights, and kind of do a threat model of what you're going to be doing. Who might be angry with what you're doing? What kind of legal resources they have? How likely is it that they will litigate? And I would like to always remember about the diligence and the kind of not being an activist, which sometimes is hard for many of journalists who are coming from an activist background, or even are working for a social media profile related to a specific cause. A lot of those people are doing wonderful journalistic work, but they just don't have the kind of craft that you might learn from your older colleagues at a proper media outlet. So if you're one of those people, then definitely, if you're documenting, be just there for the sake of documenting, especially if you're wearing a press badge or a press, any kind of press emblem. Because if you're mixing those two, the law enforcement or the court can always say, okay, you weren't a journalist, you were just taking part in a protest and filming. So make sure you don't give them any kind of evidence to support that.
Thank you, Maciek, for the answer. Sabah, would you like to add anything to that? Do you see any, because journalists are becoming more aware and take more precautions?
Yeah, I mean, I think pre-publication advice is something that a lot of journalists are now looking for. It's not something that Media Defence specifically does, but we are part of networks of organisations that do offer this. In terms of from a legal point of view, I mean, one of the things that we always speak about when we're speaking to journalists generally is, good practice, responsible journalism, whether the information that you're doing or you're writing about is in the public interest. Did you do your checks? Because I think if the case was to go to court, if you have done various kind of checks and measures, and the outcome is still not great for the journalist, you still may have a defense. So under kind of, there's a House of Lords case in English defamation law, which provides the Reynolds defense. So this is concerning kind of privileged, qualified privilege for publication of defamatory comments, but that were made in the public interest. So it's basically designed to protect serious investigative journalists that are acting in good faith and reporting on matters of public interest, even when the allegations are false or damaging. if they have taken certain measures and been, they can rely on this defence. It's basically, there's kind of a non-exhaustive criteria that the House of Lords came up with when they were looking at what, who would qualify for this defence. But, what was the seriousness of the allegation? What was the nature of the information? What was your source? What were the steps taken to verify the information? Was there comment, sought from the injured party, etc.? What was the tone of the article? What was the urgency and the timing? So even if a journalist has done all of those things, but essentially has still published something that is false, but it's in the public interest, they will still have a defence under the Reynolds defence. So it is important for journalists, obviously, from like a legal point of view, to kind of make sure that they do take the time and measures to be able to kind of fact check and verify, because if the case does go to court, they can obviously, they can justify it. And sometimes it's not, sometimes the urgency of getting a news report out is more than doing, the checks. But that's obviously a judgment call for each journalist to make. But from a legal point of view, from a lawyer's perspective, if they can answer that they have kind of looked into all of these things before publication, they may still be able to kind of rely on certain defences that are available to them, despite the comments still being false or potentially defamatory.
Thank you very much for this comment. And on our side, on Journalism Funds, I would just like to add that actually legal screening costs can be included in the budget for proposals that are submitted. And we're also actively encouraging you to do that, because it's definitely worth checking everything beforehand and adding, cost and time to these legal checks, rather than face legal prosecution, and which is also costly, and those costs are much higher. So thank you, Gustavo, for your question. I think we got some more insights, and I guess now we can pass the floor to Maciek Piasecki. Sabah, would you like to introduce Maciek?
Yeah, I'll just introduce Maciek. So Maciek has been, as mentioned, he's been following human rights movements in Poland and Belarus and other European countries for almost a decade. He specializes in live coverage of protest events and humanitarian efforts. Hopefully Maciek will talk a little bit about his own kind of legal proceedings against the Polish police related to his work on climate and humanitarian action, specifically a case where he was violently arrested during filming at a protest, and in others where he's been acquitted of other kind of misdemeanors after a lengthy court battle. I'll pass over to Maciek to kind of give an overview and speak a little bit more about his own personal experience.
Hello, and thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's attending. And it's always distressing and very sad for me to hear about this extreme examples of violence towards journalists. I'm lucky enough to be living in a country where that didn't happen to any journalists. Like torture or assassinations are. We are lucky enough to have seen that, and hopefully you see that in your own countries. And it's important to remember that even if you're not facing such an extreme threat, if you're just being fined for just doing your work, or you're being called to show up at a police station and face interrogation, these are state repressions as well. And in some of our countries, we are privileged enough to be only facing those, but the state institutions and the law enforcement will use those kind of socially acceptable tactics against you, just to discourage you from doing your work. And it's not something that captures public imagination. It might not even be very consequential for you, because in one of my cases, I was just fined 100 zlotys, which is about 20 euros, and I'm pretty sure my editorial office would have covered that. But we were very adamant to go through with it to the very end when I was finally acquitted. But that took at least several days out of my life, showing up in court, taking part in the interrogations, working with lawyers, and in making the appeals. In that case, my costs were covered by my editorial office. But if your office doesn't have this kind of supporting organization, that might be a big strain on the budget. And also, if you're working at an investigative outlet, as I used to, then probably your legal team has a lot on their hands already. So we were often involved in this kind of triage where you need to assess your priorities. So defense was always more important than actual litigation. But I was really happy with how my office, Okopres, has reacted. And even when I was no longer working for the office, I was still getting legal support in that particular case. So having a good policy at your outlet on that is very important, and having that pre-written possibly, so members of the team will know that the outlet will support them. I think it's very important. For the past 2 years, I've been mostly freelancing and going to protests and these kind of activist direct actions to cover them, just to gather my material, which I could later possibly sell. So that has proven a big challenge. Especially that it's not like editors are pushing you to go there, and it's not usually the top story of the day, and I've observed that for many editors this is more of a hassle, because when working as an editor myself, I know that it doesn't translate for advertisers' interest, or a lot of these stories have a narrower audience than on the news politics, let's say. So that's another challenge, and having a prospect of having to spend money for legal aid, that can be this kind of self-censorship mechanism that one of you mentioned in the questions. So that's also something that you take into account. Maybe I'm just not going to follow these activists. Maybe I'm just not going to go to as Barış said, and follow them to the mine, to the actual mine. Maybe I'm just going to rely on what the police has said, and just call the activists, and that's it. And with a resource-trained newsroom, that's often the case. And I've seen working for the public media, for example, that a lot of journalists just trust, and editors just trust the police more, because the police just issued their official statement. And from what I've seen, the law enforcement agencies are often really good at maybe not openly lying as to face consequences of that, but presenting the situation in a way that is very much to use the right word, well, supporting their case in a particular incident. While I was actually filming those direct actions, the law enforcement were often trying to bar me from investigating the kind of tactics they use. Moment when they use force against activists, for example. And I have been arrested with the use of force 2 years ago. It's a pending legal battle, and it will probably last, I don't know how long, but I'm prepared for several years. So it's not like it's something that you can get off your head easily. What helped me is that I'm always filming. I was specializing in live streaming these kind of events over the past 8 years or so, and there has been a lot of protest movement during the Law and Justice, the conservative government rule in Poland, and the civil society was very much mobilized, and also this kind of documentation process. But it seems to me that while the police tactics have changed, they are the state apparatus here in Poland is definitely hostile towards environmental activists, and we've seen that in what the Prime Minister Donald Tusk was saying, and his kind of tough on law and order stance on the protest by the group Last Generation, which is currently repeatedly blocking the roads and in the capital and other important places. Also we've seen one head of the public media openly saying that his outlet, which was the regional outlet for Warsaw, the capital, is not even going to name the protesting organization. They would just say there was a nuisance for drivers and people living in the city. So that was an official statement by an important people in the public media, and that was after the change of government to the one that is widely considered to be much more democratic, much more following the rule of law here in Poland. But that doesn't mean that journalists are having an easier time. I was recently fined for allegedly standing on the public road and blocking it while I was filming, and for obstructing authority in some way. So that's a pending case. It's a 1,000 zloty fine, so 200 euros roughly. So that would be, let's say, 5% of a journalistic pay here in Poland. So it's not a massive form of repression, but still something that hits you. So I have already appealed, and definitely in each of these cases, I would say appeal until you receive the outcome that is beneficial to you, or if it ends up in a court of a higher profile, there's going to be much more interest in this kind of case, and you're also supporting your whole journalistic community in that, because people will know that they can fight for their rights, and in case of my country, it's very much important for me that I am following the local laws. I am aware of my journalistic mission that's written in the Polish Constitution. I am aware of the Polish media law. And it's good if you check the ones in your country, so you can always use that as your testimony in court. Because as I said, and what's emphasized here, we're not activists. We're actually doing our public trust work that is often embedded in the national law. And it was very important for me when I was arrested that I knew that my devices were secured, that because that's also a part of that's written in the Polish law, that you as a journalist you are obliged not to disclose the data of your informers. So that's another way you can prove to the court that you were following the law and in every single step. In my case, it's I'm pretty sure It's helping me that my footage was often used by the Polish court themselves, but despite the efforts of the 8 years of law and justice rule, Polish courts are still very much independent, but that varies from country to country. So it's not always possible to rely on those. But from what I know, speaking with my friends from other countries, even the basic diligence in trying to follow the law will help you eventually. I don't want to give you particular advice for your situation because you know it best, and if you don't know it best, try to consult with a lawyer. Something that really helped me was just being trained by a group of lawyers, and often what's the actual on the ground situation when you're reporting on where you're facing a backlash campaign. It's not going to be reflected in the law per se. One thing I asked was like, okay, I'm filming a protest. The police is obstructing me from actually documenting what they're doing. How do I tell them to let me through? And what the lawyers have told me is, well, they won't care. Even if you have the legal right to do that, just try to find a way to get through and try to do your job. And but this can still end up very badly for you. I was detained, handcuffed, taken to a police station only thanks to the intervention of a human rights lawyer I work with. I was able to be released on the same day. And no charges were pressed actually in that particular case. I cannot tell you a lot of the details because it's still pending. But it's interesting that the police decided to arrest me and did not press charges. So right now we're actually litigating against the police. So that's something you can use as well. And it will take a lot of your time. It will take a toll on your nerve. So be prepared for that, but ultimately you're doing something good for the society and the profession. And please remember that this is not just an individual thing. What you're doing is, in many cases, enshrined in the national law, and also the kind of international organizations that your country might be part of. So, but it's not gonna be easy. That's what I can tell you. So, if you've got any questions, I'm always happy to consult. You can ask here, or I'm gonna put my email address in the messages box right now. I'm also happy to do some consultations in terms of security for you. We're doing that commercially right now with some former journalists, but also if you have important calls and you're facing this kind of threats that we've been talking about, we're happy to consult for free as well.
Thank you so much, Maciek. I think this was very informative and, very practical in terms of your real first-hand experience. I see some questions in the chat. I also importantly see some more context for people who are ready to help journalists to prevent, respond, and defend themselves against legal attacks, which is great. So please, everybody have a look. And in the meantime, I wanted, before we proceed to Q&A directly, I wanted to ask everybody and Sabah in the first place a couple of things. One, if you see within Europe, I mean, geographically speaking, any countries which are specifically hard in the last couple of years, like much harder than the others compared to the rest? And what kind of cases, maybe specifically, whether it has to do with more governmental lines or more companies opening the cases? And the second question would be, Barış mentioned that acquittance rate in Turkey is actually quite high. But I was wondering what's the situation in other countries. For example, we probably all heard about environmentalists and climate activists getting actual prison charges in the UK. But what's the acquittance rate for journalists? I mean, not only in the UK, but generally, if you could say that it's, it takes money, it takes time of your life, but chances of you ending up in prison are not that high, or facing a really high fine.
I can kick off, and then if anyone else has got some comments, please feel free to add in. I think we are seeing a shift at the moment. There's been some recent case law that's come out of the European Court as well. We're seeing stuff happening in the US with environmental cases and the kind of responsibilities of kind of corporations, etc. So I think there is a massive shift. In terms of whether there's one country that's harder than the other, I mean, I think there's a multitude of factors that would kind of fold into that question. And it's hard to answer bluntly. I mean, the independence of the judiciary, the fact that, oftentimes you have other state actors that aren't able to kind of conduct effective investigations, etc. I mean, some countries are definitely more prevalent in not, doing kind of not being able to carry out these investigations, not having independent courts, etc. From in Europe, for example, from Media Defence's perspective, not just environmental journalism, but just across the board, because our work relates to all types of journalism, or supporting the work of all types of journalists in the public interest. One of the strategies is just to go through the domestic framework, regardless of whether the acquittal or the outcome is going to be positive, because if you are able to exhaust domestic remedies, you will be able to access the European Court. And it's at the European Court that you might be able to get a wider or a precedent that it's more fruitful in terms of the outcome that you're wanting to achieve. So that is a legal strategy for us. When we are looking at cases, I think in the domestic court, sometimes, especially if you're working with like public funds under legal aid, you have to demonstrate that there is a prospect of success for you to take those cases on. But for these types of cases, then at Media Defence and the work that we do and the work that we fund, that's not something that we necessarily prioritise or look at, because our legal strategy is such that you want to get the positive outcome, and that may mean that you have to access an international court to be able to do that. So you just need to, not as a tick box, but you need to go through the domestic framework and exhaust that for you to be able to access the European Court. And you do see, obviously, I talked about the Russian case of, the Greenpeace activists, etc. And that was obviously a positive judgment that got given down by the European Court, whereby there was a declaration and understanding that the kind of arrest and the detention by the Russian state was arbitrary. And it actually breached the freedom of expression of the journalists involved. It also looked at the other kind of concepts around what constitutes to be a journalist, etc. So yeah, in brief, that's kind of a slight answer in terms of acquittal rate, legal strategy, and what countries or what we would do from Media Defence's perspective in situations or in climates or judicial climates that are quite tricky. That is not necessarily a preventative for us. It may mean that we need to craft a strategy that understands that to be able to get an end outcome that is favorable for the client or the journalist.
Thank you very much for the answer, Sabah. I don't know if Barış or Maciek could add anything to that.
Sorry, not to that, but I saw a question that I want to, if I may jump in, yeah. So now I lost that screen, but somebody asked if, as a freelancer, when they're working for an established outlet, would they get legal help? And they thought they would. And then, unfortunately, in the case of MLSA, we have a number of clients who got in trouble for, while reporting on assignments for these very established outlets. And unfortunately, they basically ghost you and I'm not going to name names, but this has been our experience as well. And but I'm not going to obviously not I don't know what legally can be done, but in some cases we have another organization here called the Foreign Media Organization Association, and so sometimes it might be helpful to put a pressure on them, especially for resources, even if they won't let you use their lawyer, they could maybe help financially. So I would say, if you can become a member of the union and freelancers associations, because for example, we have a system when there's a disagreement between the employer, the assignment giver and the freelance journalist. So we write to them, we're like, there's this about you. And then when an association approaches them, they take it seriously and they understand that it could hurt their reputation. So if there's a way to make sure that they, add that into your contract, whatever. But in most cases, if you're not a full-time employee, they will not. And the only way I can suggest is just, join as many unions or freelancer associations as you can, and have these complaint mechanisms, and they sometimes work.
I think that's really helpful. Is there anything else, Maciek and Sabah, that you would like to add to this question? How freelance journalists know that? Well, you mentioned quite a few things already in your part.
Yeah, I would say that check your legal framework. In Poland, for example, under Polish law, you need to be either employed by an editorial office or assigned on this particular subject. So no speculative work. What I did, I just set up my own agency with a few friends who are in a similar situation and whom I trust that they will use their press IDs professionally. So this might be the case for you. Interestingly, the European Court of Justice verdict from 2019 broadens this definition very much. But so I know that when the case ends up in court, I have the upper hand here. But when I'm facing a policeman who's telling me I'm not a journalist because I'm not employed by an office, and I tell them that, oh, I'm a freelancer and I work with this outlet and that outlet, they're still not going to treat me seriously. So look for ways to fit into the legal administrative process as much as possible, because the police are not trained in law. They are trained in anything that they're doing at the moment. And sometimes here in Poland, that's the case. Police is very much untrained because of the lack of people who want to work for the police. So I think it's 15 to 20% vacant position in the police. So you will have untrained people working with you in a similar situation. And it's your responsibility to remain professional. Don't get into arguments with the police. Don't insult the police. Don't, by any chance, give them anything that might don't do anything that might look like you're attacking them, because usually the courts believe the police. So unless you have very strong evidence that you didn't hit the policeman with your tripod, etc. Oh, there was a case in Poland where a photographer was accused of kicking a policeman during a protest. And this was a situation of a very tight kettling. So she went through a lot of trouble to prove her innocence. She was eventually acquitted, but that was a lot of work on her side as well. I've testified in that case and provided footage as the evidence. So if you are able not to go alone, but have another person that is going to be documenting everything, and especially your interactions with the law enforcement, that might be very important if you're filming or in any way covering this kind of direct action. But also if you just run a social media profile that relates to environmental environmental issues, then make sure that you're as much legally covered in terms of whether that's a registered business, an NGO, or you can operate as a freelancer in your country or be registered with the journalist union, because that's the case in some countries as well. Like, you need to have a proper journalistic badge to see what applies to you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to pass it back to Sabah with two questions, actually, before we could hear a few words maybe about the financial support that media defense can provide in urgent cases. Could you also maybe say a few words about cross-border cases and extradition cases as well?
Sure, yeah. So just kind of in reverse order, just about some of the support that media defense can offer to journalists, because I see in the chat, obviously, and it's been touched upon by the other speakers, is what do you do if you're a freelancer? You don't have the funds to be able to cover a cost if the case is initiated against you personally as a journalist, as opposed to the media outlet. And what happens if you don't have the contractual obligations with that outlet? Well, that is kind of what media defense is about. We offer legal support to journalists that find themselves in exactly those situations. So what we can do is we can provide financial support to cover the costs of your legal case in the country that you are facing the legal threat. We work with the local lawyers, and we're able to kind of fund those cases at the various levels, the court level. So if it's a case that's going through the court of first instance, and then if it gets appealed, subsequent proceedings will be able to financially support those cases. If it's a case that deals with an issue that impacts a journalist from reporting in the public interest, I think in the chat, my colleague has sent some links of how you can apply for our financial support. And as I mentioned, we work globally, so we're not restricted in terms of where we offer that support. What we're also seeing is that journalists that are facing multiple cases, so again, this is tactical. So they're facing, for example, slap suits that are happening in Brazil against a particular journalist. They're facing it in several different states of Brazil, which is just a concerted effort to drain their resources. So for us, again, as media defense, we can support multiple cases, and we can work with the lawyers. So that's the kind of the emergency defense aspect of our work. In terms of the strategic litigation, as I kind of touched upon, we can take cases on, and if there's an opportunity for us to access an international or a regional court, we'll do so to try and set a wider precedent to advance freedom of expression standards for journalists. So again, we do a lot of work at the European Court in relation to journalists that have been arbitrarily detained, tortured, have had their devices removed, have been removed from protests. We're doing a lot of work around spyware, or journalists that have been infected with quite intrusive spyware, in an effort to try and stop them from reporting, etc. We work in Latin America, so we have cases before the Inter-America Court and Commission, and we work in Africa, the various African tribunals, so the East African Court of Justice, the ECOWAS Court, the African Commission. Some of them are a lot more effective than others in our experience, but yeah, we will get involved. With Asia and the Middle East, our kind of, because there's no overarching legal mechanism in terms of a court process, we can't access that. But what we do there is we kind of access the UN mechanisms, the special procedures. We do a lot of work with the UN Working Group on arbitrary detention to get opinions come out, for example, with our work in Vietnam, to demonstrate that the journalist that has been detained arbitrarily, and there is an opinion that is put forward by the UN body to say that this journalist should be released. We can use that for advocacy efforts. Whilst we don't do advocacy, we have partner organisations that can do that, that can then obviously heighten and give prominence to the case. So in terms of our support, it's quite wide. It's not just limited to the financial support, it's also the legal support. And the two can work alongside each other, or we can, we're pretty flexible in terms of how we work. So whatever is required, we can, if you get in touch with us and speak to us, our grants team and our legal team will be able to kind of come up with a way of trying to assist those journalists. So yeah, please do get in touch with us, and please look on the chat for any links to our websites and our social media pages, etc. If you need to get support. I've actually forgotten the second question that you had asked, Anna.
Yes, I wanted to ask if you could briefly, because we have minutes left, give some advice for cross-border cooperations, because sometimes there are more issues to consider, when you're not a citizen of a country or the other way around. And maybe mention some extradition cases that you had to work with and how that went.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of extraterritorial jurisdiction, that's something that we've been doing a lot of work around in the past few years. We've intervened in cases dealing with this on the basis that cross-border investigations by journalists mean that the information that's going from one state to another and the interception of that data, for example, may have an impact on an investigative journalist's work. So there was a case before the European Court, which was Weider versus the UK, in which the UK was intercepting data in relation to an individual that was outside of the UK, and then passing that to intelligence agencies. And we intervened as a third party, saying the effect of doing that for investigative journalists that aren't based in that same jurisdiction is going to have a massive effect. And the judgment came out on that, and our intervention was actually cited. So we do a lot of work in terms of, or we have done a lot of work in terms of what the legal ramifications for journalists that aren't based in the same jurisdiction but are kind of victim to state actions where they're not physically present, without kind of getting into the legal technical kind of details, because it can be quite a complex area. We've submitted cases before the European Court on precisely that. So in cases relating to it doesn't relate to environmental journalism, but for example, armed conflict that's happening in Europe. So in cases relating to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where journalists were subject to by Azerbaijan, Armenian journalists were subjected. We've got cases before the European Court. We've made quite extensive legal arguments about the jurisdictional issues relating to that. I don't think I have the expertise to summarize that in the next 2 minutes, but for anyone that's interested or has issues around that, please do get in contact with us, because that is something that we are, we've been looking at. As I said, it's not just limited to Europe. If you're outside of Europe, we've been making those arguments before other kind of regional and international courts. But in Europe, obviously, I've cited a few just to give a flavour of the types of cases that we've been involved in at Media Defence.
If I can add to that quickly, you can also get your local members of parliament or members of European Parliament involved. That was my case when I was working in Belarus, and that helped me a lot. Even if your own state is sometimes hostile to journalists, it should protect you. And if it doesn't, then you might have members of the opposition who can make a case for you in the international institutions as well. So especially if that's a country that is obviously violating human rights in this particular case. So
thank you very much. I think That was very helpful, and I hope that a lot of people can stay in touch or reach out to each other after this, and hopefully ensure more safety for environmental journalists. As I said, we do encourage our grantees, cross-border teams of journalists that receive our support, to include legal pre-screening in their budget, and we hope that freelance journalists can a little bit more protected in this way as well. I would like to thank Media Defense very much for their cooperation and all their knowledge and insights in this webinar, and also Barış, Altıntaş, and Maciek Piasecki for joining us and sharing their experiences and experiences of difficult realities. I hope that we can all stay positive and focused on what can be done within the legal frameworks of respective jurisdictions. Thank you so much for joining us. The recording will be available. We will send you an email with the link and a few other links. I mentioned in the chat, you can also subscribe to our newsletter. We regularly send it, but not too often, 1-2 times a month. And we share links to the investigations, many of them environmental, and also grant opportunities for environmental journalists or other interesting events for journalists. So let's stay in touch. Hope to see you in our following webinars. We have one roughly each month. Thanks so much again, and have a great afternoon.